Hey everybody, I'm here to show you one way to do sugar lift on your intaglio plates for etching. And this is a copper plate, and you can see that this has come from the distributor, from the manufacturer, with a little bit of scratches, and I've got fingerprints all over it because I've had this for a long time and it's been handled. Okay, so as with anything, dealing with etching and applying grounds, obviously you want everything to be completely degreased and polished and cleaned before you go to put any grounds on. But we're not at that stage yet. First, I just want to show you how the plate is. And for doing sugar lift, the objective is that we paint on a liquid material that has sugar as its base. It dries on the plate. When it's totally dry, meaning that it's not running, it might still be tacky, but that's pretty much as dry as it gets. Then we apply a very thin layer of Hardground over that. And then once the Hardground is totally cured and set, then we're gonna submerge the plate in a tray of hot water. And in theory, when it works correctly, what happens is that the sugar in that liquid that you painted on, it swells with moisture, and it actually lifts the Hardground off of the plate only in the areas where your paintbrush marks were. Okay, and so once it lifts the Hardground off in those areas, you want to take the plate out, dry it off, let it set for a little while. And then you can either do an open bite by just putting it into ferric chloride, or you can apply an aqua tint to it. You could apply an aqua tint to it and then use a brush to paint ferric chloride onto certain areas so that it gets more of like a washy spit bite effect to it. And so there's a lot that you can do once those open areas of your design are exposed. And the rest of the plate is still protected by the Hardground. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is address the surface of my plate, and I want to abrade it a little bit, because what happens is that with the copper, sometimes the sugar lift liquid that you paint on will bead up, and it won't actually sit and preserve those brush marks. It might start to sort of bead up because the surface of the plate is a little bit oily and it's very smooth. Okay, so what I want to do is abrade it just slightly. I've got some steel wool here. Let's see if you can see that. Okay, this is one option that I like to use. Another one that you could turn to would be just regular sandpaper. Okay, so this is a coarser grit of sandpaper. This is like, I guess, 180. And then there's, a finer one, up to 400. I mean, there are a lot of different things to choose from. I tend to find that the slightly coarser one is okay for right now. And, keep in mind that whatever gets abraded right now, it will be etched later, so it's not necessarily going to result in too much plate tone. And what you could do is potentially, burnish and polish some of those areas out selectively if you're worried about it holding a lot of plate tone. If your sugar lift is just a small area, I wouldn't do this to the whole plate necessarily. But for me, I wanna use the whole plate. So I'm just gonna lightly abrade it like this, or I'm gonna use my steel wool. I prefer the steel wool just because it doesn't rough up the surface as much, okay? I'm not so worried at this moment about getting my fingerprints, my oily handprints on it, because I'm gonna do something later to degrease the plate, okay? So right now I just wanna sort of take some of the shine off. So if you can tell where it's been abraded a little bit, and see the difference between how it was a few minutes ago. I find that this just helps the sugar lift sit a little bit flatter onto the plate, if that makes sense. So I'm just gonna go in a few different directions and try to get the entire plate. I want it to be consistent for my purposes. So for the imagery that I know that I'm gonna put on here, I want it to be consistent, and I'm just gonna go to the edges. Okay, that's that. It's not perfect. I'm not too worried about that, and I want to keep it short for the sake of the video. Okay, so the next thing that I want to talk about is the sugar lift itself. Okay, so in this case, there are a few different recipes that you can use. Some involve using Karo syrup, which is something that you can get in the baking aisle at the grocery store, and others consist of just, literally just sugar in a saturated solution. Okay, so what I had on hand is I just had some sugar in the raw, and I took this clean jar and I put some sugar in the jar, and then I slowly poured hot boiling water over the sugar. And I only put in a little bit at a time because I want this solution to be totally saturated with sugar, meaning that all of the sugar is dissolving, and if I put more sugar in, it would also dissolve, but almost to the point of the water not being able to take any more sugar, if that makes sense. So I want it to be a very sweet syrup, and then once I've got it to the consistency that I want, I mean, you can see it's relatively runny, okay? Almost like the consistency of India ink. I also take some dish soap, okay? So I have 7th generation, colorless, odorless, kind of natural dish soap at home, and that's what I use. I put a few drops in there because that acts as what they call a surfactant, and that also helps the water sort of flow a little bit better. And the next thing that I add in is some India ink or a colorant. Okay, so you could possibly use food coloring. I haven't tried that. The typical thing that we put in is black India ink. I didn't really have any, but I had this liquid watercolor from Blick. Okay. So I put in a few drops of that as well, so that I can actually see the liquid when it's painted onto the surface of the copper. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I've got some paper towels here on the side. I've got some plastic sheeting down on my table. This is basically a non-toxic method at this stage. It only becomes toxic once you're using the traditional Hardground to cover the plate in the next step. So right now, I mean, all of this I made in my kitchen. I'm doing this on my back porch. I have ventilation, but you really want ventilation when it comes time to do the application and the drying, curing of the Hardground. I'm going to put a few more drops of this into the solution just to make it a little bit darker, so that I can really see it when I'm painting it onto the copper. And again, this is just the fully saturated sugar and water solution with a few drops of liquid dishwashing soap, the kind that I would just use to wash my dishes by hand. Some recipes call for detergent, but I think really any kind of simple soap that doesn't have any crazy additives to it would work just fine. I have a cup of water here so I can rinse out my brushes. And what I'm going to do now, before I actually get started, is that I do want to degrease my plate. Okay, so I've got a spray bottle here that is full of vinegar, and I'm just going to spray this on. Okay, and then I'm going to take one of my paper towels, and I'm just going to gently go over that. Okay. For me, one of the things that I really like about Sugar Lift when it works nicely is that it is very painterly. It is a little bit uncontrollable. You don't always know how well it's going to lift the ground off later. So you want to start with a fairly degreased surface so that the sugar lift just kind of sits well on that copper. Okay. Drying that off a little bit more, I'm going to take another piece over here and just go over it one more time. And again, I mean, obviously I still have all my fingerprints there, but I did, use the vinegar to just take that initial oily grime off of the surface of the plate. It sort of de-tarnishes it slightly as well. Okay, so I've got a variety of brushes over here, and you can use really big ones. You can get a brush stroke that's very calligraphic if you want. The other thing that I did, sometimes in the past is that I would maybe lightly draw something onto the plate ahead of time, just like a little dry point line or something, so that I had something to follow when I am doing my more painterly marks with the paintbrush. So I just have a dry point scribe here, and I could draw an outline of something that I wanted. And now I'm just going to go right into the solution here, and I'm just going to go for it and paint on here. So one thing to keep in mind with sugar lift is that in theory it shouldn't matter how thin or thick it is, and just keep in mind that the variations in tone that you're seeing from the pooling and the puddling of the pigment is not going to reflect what your value range is actually going to be. Okay, so the value range that these marks will carry will be determined by what you do to those open areas later. So meaning if you apply a rosin or a spray paint aqua tint over the whole plate, and then you leave the plate in the acid for 20 minutes or 5 minutes or 40 minutes, that will determine, just like a regular aqua tint, what the value in these lines will be. Okay, so it's very easy to sort of get seduced by the way that it puddles and pools, but just think of these marks as just flat silhouettes right now, okay? You can see that there's a little bit of, if you used a drier brush or a stiffer brush, you could actually get more brushstroke effect, so maybe I'm going to take this dry brush and go in here and sort of swoop through these and see what that does. The other thing that I would suggest is that with this method, less is more. Okay, so if there's any residue anywhere on the plate, that could lift the Hardground up later on, okay, which is ideally what you want. But what I mean by that is that if you go back in and keep going over things, you're just going to be spreading that around, in the sense that maybe some of these really fresh details that you get from those initial spontaneous marks get blended too much, and they sort of get absorbed by new marks that go over them, okay? I hope that makes sense. So I like to sort of leave the mark alone if it's a mark that I like, and I don't try to rework it or, change it too much. The reason why I'm going over some of these in sort of a cross direction is because I do want to see if I can achieve some of that cool kind of like brush stroke look, where you get the actual hairs of the brush, the bristles of the brush, leaving a trail that you can see. Okay, so I'm just kind of messing with that a little bit. Okay, but for instance here, I would not, in this area, I would not touch that anymore. I would just leave it alone and let it dry. Okay, so obviously this is a sugar mixture. You want to keep it nice and closed to avoid bugs or, animals from getting into it. And you want to clean out your brushes just with water. That's fine. The next step is that you want to let this dry. So I've got an example that I made last night. And I'll turn this around so you can see the image. So what I did was I've been working simultaneously in ceramic, and I took a picture of something that I made recently in ceramic, and I decided I wanted to try to make an etching of that sculpture. Okay, so I actually just sort of taped the photocopy down onto my plate. Obviously, I didn't reverse it. Okay, so if I needed it to be exactly what is in the image, I would have to reverse it and sort of poke through from the back, or trace this onto tracing paper, flip it, and then go over the back. What I did was I just used my scribe once the paper was taped onto the plate, and I just sort of poked through the photocopy to outline the major elements of the object and of the design. I didn't try to go into any kind of detail. I just was more concerned about the proportion being faithful to my photocopy. So I just made little tiny marks with the dry point scribe that were just barely perceptible to me. It helped that I had a lamp to the side that created a raking light over the plate so I could see it more easily. And then I just painted freehand where I wanted the marks to be. And I think, we'll see how this turns out. This is nice and dry, but by dry, I mean that it's still tacky, okay? And so it's never going to dry completely. And in fact, if it were completely, perfectly hardened and dried, it might not lift well enough later, when you have to do the lifting part with the hot water. So by dry, I mean that it's not gonna run, it's not totally coming off on my finger, but the thick areas are coming off a little bit. So I don't want to touch them too much. The thinner areas are not picking up too much onto my finger at all. So I consider this, it sat overnight. If I wanted to accelerate the setting up process, I could use a hair dryer on a low setting to heat that and accelerate the drying of the marks. I opted not to do that this time. So this is ready to be covered with Hardground. Okay, so I'm going to stop the video here, and we'll rejoin each other when I'm at that stage.